Hello YouTube! This is a response video. The video I'm responding to is by Dr. Winters. The video is titled Thunderfoot, Sexual Dimorphism, Fallacies and Anti-Feminism. In that video she encourages her viewers to visit an article published on the blog of a physicist, Professor Philip Moriarty. The bulk of this video will be dealing with that article and the position that the professor takes in relation to sexual dimorphism. Let's begin.
Hey everyone, Christy here, and I was sent a link to this WordPress article by its author, and that is Professor Philip Moriarty. I can just quickly open this in a new tab. And he sent me this this blog entry because it has to do with Thunderfoot or Dr. Phil Mason and his claims about sexual dimorphism. And the author knew that this was a topic that Thunderfoot and I have in the past bumped into each other about and disagreed with each other about, mostly because his position has no evidence, and that for me is a problem. So what I thought I would do is, after asking for
Dr. Winters makes two claims. The first claim is that Thunderfoot has no evidence to support his position on sexual dimorphism, and the second claim is that sexual dimorphism is somehow not a credible or a plausible scientific explanation. Let's go through this article then. We start off roughly halfway down Professor Moriarty's blog post. The preceding paragraphs are not relevant to the issue that we're interested in. Now, I've previously read this article and I've highlighted some key points. The first one being argumentative fallacies. Now, the professor does like his fallacies. There's an interesting fallacy called the fallacy. And you commit this fallacy when you discount an argument because it contains a fallacy. Somebody can make an extremely bad argument, but the conclusion could still be correct. Simply because an argument contains a fallacy is not in itself sufficient to discount that argument. So that's a point worth noting as we proceed. Mason makes some astoundingly weak and remarkably unscientific arguments on the topic of sexual dimorphism. Now, there are two issues there. The first one is the accusation that Thunderfoot's arguments are weak, and the second is that the arguments that he makes are unscientific. They're two very important points. That's an oblique personal insult. I'm not sure why the good professor thinks it's wise to pepper his articles with such things. Can show a remarkable and complete disregard for scientific evidence and the scientific method. Now, that's quite a harsh statement to make, isn't it? Mason's argument runs like this, and I quote, "You see, we are part of a sexually dimorphic species. That is, males and females tend to have different physical characteristics. Look, the reason that we divide the Olympics up by sex is not because we are inherently sexist, it's because men and women tend to have different traits. On average, in upper body strength, it's almost 50% difference. Come on, tell me again how this is really a myth." So that's Thunderfoot's position on the matter. Mason again used the performance of men and women at the Olympics to attempt to explain away the gender imbalance in physics. Well, is that a fair summary of his position? Because it seems to me like Thunderfoot is using the Olympics as an idealized example. People are familiar with the Olympics, so he's using the Olympics to highlight sexual dimorphism. I don't think he's suggesting that because men run faster than women, therefore physics. I don't think that's his suggestion at all. So I think that's a misunderstanding of his position. Performance of males versus females at the Olympics. Yeah, well, this is the same thing, really. Where's the evidence to support this hypothesis? Well, we might look at that later on in the video. Is nothing more than an appeal to the fallacy of personal incredulity. Now, he does like his fallacies, doesn't he, the professor? Now, he cites two studies in the article, but I don't think they actually support his position, to be honest. So let's have a look at them. The first paper cited in Professor Moriarty's article is a meta-analysis of sex differences in human brain structure. Now, this paper concludes that there are differences in volume and tissue density between the sexes. It's a meta-study, so I think it surveys something like 160, 169 different studies, and its conclusions are not really unusual. So it does seem to confirm Thunderfoot's position that humans are actually a dimorphic species. Hardly a surprising conclusion, I don't think. So we won't spend too much time on it. A more interesting study is the second. Sex beyond the genitalia. The human brain mosaic. Whereas a categorical difference in genitals has always been acknowledged, well, that's hardly going to get you a Nobel Prize, is it? But the key line is documented sex-gender differences in the brain are often taken as support of a sexually dimorphic view of human brains. So the authors are making 2 points here. One is the sex-gender differences are well documented, and these documented differences are often used to make the claim that the human brain is sexually dimorphic. So this single line supports Thunderfoot's position, doesn't it? The differences in structure are well documented, and these differences in structures can be used to suggest that the human brain is sexually dimorphic. That doesn't contradict Thunderfoot's position at all, as far as I can see. But this study is rather odd, and I'll explain why. This line. Rather, such a distinction requires the fulfillment of two conditions. One, the form of the elements that show sex-gender differences should be dimorphic, that is, with little overlap. Now, what they've done in this sentence is redefine dimorphism. You see, dimorphism occurs within a species. For instance, human male and females are of the same species. So these two groups are going to be incredibly similar. The differences between the male and female are what we define as dimorphism. So what they're saying here is that, well, actually, to be dimorphic, you have to have very little overlap. Well, that's genetically impossible because, for instance, the genetic difference between races is something like 0.6%, 0.8, rounded up to, say, 1% of the genetic difference. The difference between male and female is 2%, so that's quite significant, but it's 2%. That means that males and females are going to be more similar rather than different. For instance, the Thunderfoot uses the Olympics as an example of dimorphism. So if we say that men run faster, not all men will run faster than all women. You will have a large overlap. That's just the nature of it. That's just what happens within a species. Men will be capable of lifting heavier weights. They'll be stronger in general. But not all men will be stronger than all women. You will still have women who will be stronger than some men. And if we think of the Olympics, I'm pretty sure that female weightlifters will be stronger than quite a large percentage of the men watching them in the audience. So this is a redefinition, and it's not really convincing, is it? They're setting up a straw man. They're setting up a criteria which is easy to disprove, because basically it's a nonsense criteria. If we go a bit further down, I'll point out what I mean. These distributions, figure D, they describe sexual dimorphism. That's what you'd expect in a distribution. You won't have a large separation between the male and the female groups. And if we look at figure E, females against males, there's 2 points I'd like to make on this figure. The first, if you look at the colours first, the pink is female traits, the white is intermediate traits, and the blue are male traits. If you look at the female to male group, what you see is that the females are predominantly pink with a smattering of blue, and the males are predominantly blue with a smattering of pink. That is sexual dimorphism. That's what you would expect if he was using the conventional definition of dimorphism. The other thing that you'd think rather odd about that particular diagram, if we look at the supporting paper and look at the figure B, look at the predominance of pink in the female and the predominance of blue in the male column. Now, that is distinctly showing a difference between the male and the female populations. But the interesting thing about that diagram is not the fact that it displays dimorphism, it's the fact that the sampling bias at the top, you've got females 157 and the males 106. Now, why would you oversample females in a study that is basically designed to compare? Why is there this oversampling? There's no logical reason for it. They could have picked if the original studies had a predominance of females, they could have randomly picked or selected to equalize the two samples, but they chose not to do that. Anyway, something to think about. So I don't think this paper proves what Professor Moriarty thinks it proves, and I'm very surprised that a physical scientist missed the quite obvious red flags that are splattered all over this study, I've got to be honest. Anyway, we'll progress. So those were the two studies cited in Professor Moriarty's blog post. If we think back, there were two claims made. The first claim was that Thunderfoot's arguments were weak, and the second claim was that his arguments were unscientific. Having looked at the studies that Professor Moriarty himself has cited in this article, is that a reasonable position to take? Well, I suggest not, because the first study, the meta-study, confirms Thunderfoot's position. And there's quite a large body of scientific evidence that supports that position. The second study is focused on mitigating the structural differences between male and female brains. It doesn't contradict Thunderfoot's position. And in that study, the authors admit that the structural differences between male and female brains could be used to make the case that the male and female brain are sexually dimorphic. So the professor is quite wrong in making these claims. But the key thing is that sexual dimorphism effects are often at the limits of detection. Now, some are quite open to measurement. Density and volume or mass are quite open to measurement. They're not at the limits of detection. A lot of the structural differences between the male and female brain are open to measurement. So that's not an entirely accurate statement to make, is it? There are intellectual areas in which females on average excel and males on average excel. Psychological, social and biological factors explain these differences, however. It does not seem that biology is limiting intelligence in any way, because biology alone cannot explain the vast improvement of female performance on certain measures, such as the increasing numbers of females scoring at the highest end of the SAT mass test. Well, I'm sorry, but you're conflating two different things here, aren't you? The test for general intelligence is not the same as mass testing. You're testing two different things. You have general intelligence on one side, and you've got a test of an acquired skill on another. Because the test results in maths vary, does not mean that the general intelligence is tracking that variation. They're two different things. You're not measuring the same thing. Data showing differences between men and women in intelligence do not support the notion of a smarter sex. Well, that's just non sequitur, isn't it? Just doesn't follow. If you've got subject A and you have subject B, and you find a consistent difference between measurements in A and B, the one thing you can't claim is that A equals B. It does not follow. The emphasis is mine. Mason indulged in a series of argumentative fallacies. We do love our fallacies, don't we, Professor? And we've committed a few ourselves, haven't we? So that's the article. I could go through the second paper in detail, but that would require a different video. That would be quite a lengthy analysis. But I think it might be worthwhile to do another video on sexual dimorphism itself. In conclusion, is Dr. Winters correct in her denial of sexual dimorphism? Of course not. In the light of overwhelming scientific evidence, to take such a position is silly. Is her claim that Thunderfoot has no evidence to support his argument? Well, I refer you to the 2 papers that are cited in Moriarty's article, which proves that such a claim is obviously wrong. Does Moriarty make a good case? Well, no, it's a somewhat clumsy and politically driven position. He loves peppering his post with references to alleged fallacies, while committing the worst fallacy that a physical scientist can make, the moralistic fallacy. He would have to believe that 2 complex systems, the male and female brain, while structurally different, are in fact functionally equivalent. That may be the case, but it's extremely unlikely, and the evidence suggests otherwise. Males tend to vary across many traits, and there's a wider distribution in general IQ within the male population. And while it may result in more physicists, it also means that males are overrepresented in our prison system. There are more boys and girls diagnosed as being autistic. The ratio can be as high as 8 to 1. Autism is not a social construct, nor is it a learned behaviour, and a ratio of 8 to 1 cannot be claimed to be barely measurable. Thank you for listening.